Well, we're on 2:30 by my clock. You think we should get started?
Yeah, let's get started. So I'll just quickly say welcome everyone to this second session of TAS's Work, Labour and Economy UBI sessions. So just in case anyone's come along since the first session, so I'm Fabian Canizo, the convener of TAS's Work, Labour and Economy thematic group, and I've had the pleasure of organising these sessions with Ben Spies-Butcher, who will now be taking over in this session. So I'm just going to have my camera off for just the first part of this because I'm cheekily eating lunch at the back here. I've gone for the full conference experience. I went down to the shops, got some little pastries, got some bread with too many seeds in it, some condiments that don't quite go together. I'm set. All right, so I'll hand it over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Fabian. And thanks everyone for coming along to this. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm on Waitematagal land, the campus of Macquarie University, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands around the country where different people are meeting to join us in this workshop. So we're also open to people from TASA, so if you haven't been part of the process of organising this, just to let you know how we're running through it. So these two sessions have been organised as related workshops on the theme of basic income, how it can help us solve social problems, how we can understand it sociologically, and what it can contribute to our understanding of the sociological. So we had one wonderful session this morning, and we've got another one this afternoon. So we're going to hear from Zoe Staines and Troy Henderson in this session, and we're also going to hear from respondents. So for each of the papers, the presenter will present for about 15 minutes. We will then move straight into hearing from two respondents. For the first paper, that will be John Altman and Elise Klein, and I'll introduce them as we come into them. We'll have an opportunity for the presenter to say a few words, and then we'll open it up for discussion with everybody. So if that sounds all okay, are there any housekeeping questions that people have before we get started? So without further ado then, I'll hand over to Dr. Zoe Staines, who's the ARC DECRA Research Fellow in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Queensland.
Thanks, Ben. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. And take that radio silence as a yes. Yes. Great. Thank you. First, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work and pay respect to their elders and leaders past and present. Thanks also to Fabian and Ben for organising and hosting this. Appreciate it and appreciate the invite to come along. And thanks to my discussants, John and Elise. I appreciate you engaging with my kind of sketchy draft of a paper so far and look forward to some more sort of discussion points today as well. Okay, so I'll jump straight in. Just want to set out some sort of caveats to start with. Firstly, the paper's title is a bit of a sham, really. Unfortunately, showing my bias there, despite a strong evidence base that punitive workfare is causing widespread harm in remote Australia and really producing limited outcomes, there is really not yet any public commitment by the Australian government to move away from it, or at least as far as I'm aware. Nevertheless, this paper optimistically focuses on alternatives. So I'm a little bit of a pessimist by nature, but I'm going to flip that and be an optimist today. Secondly, this paper isn't exhaustive. It looks at three options, but these are three amongst many different options that are out there. And also in terms of my analysis today, it's pretty brief. I'll out myself as, not being an economist, although there's lots of expertise in that area in the room. So I focus particularly on just a couple of the potential social impacts of these alternatives today. I also want to briefly sort of say that when I'm referring here to remote Australia, I'm really referring to remote Indigenous Australia, since it's Indigenous peoples who are disproportionately impacted under these policies. For example, 80% of the roughly sort of 30,000 or so, and that fluctuates, participants in the CDEP, the current remote workfare program, are Indigenous, despite only around 18% of the overall Australian Indigenous population living in remote Australia. So I just wanted to make that point as well. Okay, I'll get stuck in. So I want to start by very briefly setting the context of recent policy approaches in remote Australia with regard to both work and the provision of social security. Again, could spend days talking about the details of these different approaches. And I wrote a paper comparing, for instance, the workfare approaches a couple of years ago. So if you're interested in that, go and have a look at that. But I don't have time here, so I just want to make some very brief key points, focusing particularly on the movement away from the previous Community Development Employment Project Scheme, or CDEP, not to be confused with CDP, which removes the E and makes us all very confused, to more sort of recent workfare approaches from 2007 onwards. So I'll start with CDEP. So CDEP was established in 1977. It involved the provision of lump sum grants to mainly Indigenous councils and organisations. And those funds were basically used to support a range of community development aspirations, including, for instance, social, commercial, enterprise development, so bolstering and strengthening Indigenous organisations in particular, but also for job creation, so the use of funding as wage incomes for productive activities that straddled, importantly, both the market and non-market sectors. For example, extending to care work and work in the customary sector as well. And also, as John and Elise have also pointed out in their own work, CDEP funds were also used as a basic income in some instances to support community members, particularly those living on remote outstations. So basically by removing the conditionalities that were embedded in the CDEP design. So moving towards the early 2000s and in the midst of broader sort of critiques of welfare and the demonisation of welfare recipients in Australia and internationally, against a sort of backdrop of broader neoliberalism, CDEP came under increasing attack, primarily on the contested basis that it created a poverty trap, which prevented people from moving into better paid jobs in what was often referred to as the real economy. These critiques, of course, ignored the fact that CDEP wasn't welfare in the first place, but also drastically underplayed the issue that there weren't enough jobs to go around in remote Australia, and that there still aren't. Nevertheless, from 2007 onwards, a series of welfare to work or workfare programs were implemented in remote Australia. 4 programs that have operated in remote Australia since 2007 have differed in some regards, but their key elements have remained relatively consistent in line with sort of broader workfare policies. So I'm just going to refer to them sort of broadly as workfare and skim over those details here. But basically this shift led to some sort of key changes, the first of which was the movement of people away from stable incomes under CDEP and into the social security system, so resulting in lower and less stable incomes. For instance, Altman, Gray and Levitas estimated in 2005 that incomes under CDEP were about 71% higher than unemployment benefits or New Start at that time. And since then, as we all know here, and as was touched on in the earlier session, those unemployment benefits haven't increased over that time or since that time. And I'm obviously ignoring Job Seeker and its coronavirus supplement here because that will be removed. It's temporary. Secondly, there was a shift away from community control under CDEP towards delivery by third sector employment service providers, which is a characteristic of workfare elsewhere, obviously, which, as per critiques of workfare elsewhere as well, has resulted in perverse incentives that see providers treating clients like commodities and engaging in behaviours that align with that, like creaming and parking. Thirdly, under workfare since 2007 in particular, conditionalities and compliance have intensified over time. So there's been a strict focus on behaviour modification and little to no focus on structural causes of entrenched unemployment, like the primary barrier in remote Australia being that there are simply not enough jobs to go around, or not enough jobs in the formal economy to go around at least. So broadly speaking, the shift to workfare has had a range of negative impacts in remote Australia, including further lowering incomes and thereby exacerbating poverty, as well as being detrimental to many participants' health and well-being. with flow-on effects for their families and their dependents as well. There have, as a result, been widespread calls for changes to CDEP and some emphasis on alternative approaches, which I focus on here. So as I said earlier, I only briefly cover 3 proposals here, the first of which is the Remote Development and Employment Scheme, RDES, proposed by the Aboriginal peak organisations of the Northern Territory in 2017. The second being a job guarantee proposed by Pearson and Mitchell in 2020. And the third being a Liveable Income Guarantee proposed by Quiggin and colleagues in 2020. And I also acknowledge Elise and Troy. I'm not sure if Troy's joined us again, but you know, you're also co-authors on that proposal. So I'm either brave or stupid including this in my paper today, but we'll see. So these 3 proposals were made under different conditions. The first during a parliamentary inquiry into CDEP, while the second and third were made in 2020 in a COVID-19 context, which probably speaks to some of the differences in how the proposals are structured and framed as well. As I said, there have also been other approaches, but I look at these 3 here because they are, to my knowledge at least, the most recent sort of detailed proposals and are still very much on the table. So next I'll touch briefly on the details of these proposals, but then I'll turn to talking about 3 possible implications. I'll focus specifically on the definitions of work that are embedded in each of the proposals, the potential possible impacts on incomes, and local Indigenous control as well. Okay, I'll just briefly summarise these 3 models. So the RDES focuses specifically on remote Australia and involves 2 key elements, a continuation of workfare, but also the addition of a wage subsidy, a smaller wage subsidy. I focus just on the wage subsidy here today. A wage subsidy would create, or is proposed as creating 10,500 jobs to begin with at least, although it could be expanded, at the minimum wage and with worker entitlements. The jobs would operate on the basis of no work, no pay, and there is emphasis on transitions into the market economy over time. The job guarantee is focused on the whole of Australia, but Noel particularly speaks specifically to its possible benefits for remote communities, or its possible claimed benefits. It involves the Australian government mopping up unemployed labour by creating part and full-time jobs at the minimum wage with worker entitlements. Even though this proposal is still being developed, however, there are some significant gaps in the current documentation. For example, it's unclear who the intermediary employer is and thus who applies the proposed no work, no pay principle. Finally, the LIG is also proposed at the national level, but with specific reference to remote Australia as well. It's similar to a participation income in that there's some level of conditionality attached in the form of activities that may or may not align with work in the market economy. And essentially the income would be available to all without an adequate market income who decide to opt in. And they would then make quarterly reports about their participation activities, which would be subject to periodic auditing, for example, similar to tax returns. First, I want to talk briefly to the definitions of work embedded in each of these proposals. And I'll start with the LIG. A key focus of which is to challenge and expand the framing of work as only that which occurs in the market economy. For instance, more than just supporting someone between jobs, the LIG also supports those undertaking non-market work, like care work and participation in the customary sector. In contrast, while the RDES enables work to be defined at the community level and to thereby include things like care of country and continuation of culture to be classified as work, there is nevertheless a strong emphasis on eventual transition away from the wage subsidy and into jobs in the formal economy. This emphasis is, however, strongest under the job guarantee, where the guaranteed job is seen primarily as a site of skill development, so that the participants remain, and I quote, ready for the day the private sector picks up and can take workers out of the job guarantee into new jobs. In that respect, guaranteed jobs are really intended to sort of mimic jobs in the formal economy as much as possible, or at least in that proposal. I want to make 3 points here. So firstly, and thank you to John for your comments around this as well, all 3 proposals really fall short of something obviously like a basic income, which decouples work from income. And thus all are to varying degrees constrained within the frame of a neoliberal market logic, where income is contingent on activity and participation, which makes me think a little bit of the following anti-capitalist love note. which you can ironically buy stickers of on Redbubble for $4.25. It's a little strange. Anyway, basically, the three proposals maintain the view that we are valuable only because of our productive potential. So in thinking of remote Indigenous communities in particular and different values and approaches there, like communal sharing, there are obvious conflicts here that need to be potentially further teased out. Secondly, the very narrow frames of work in the job guarantee and RDES in particular have potential to perpetuate existing labour market inequalities, as has been noted by other job guarantee scholars elsewhere. For instance, where women who undertake care work at still overwhelmingly higher rates than men, and I should note here as well, Indigenous Australian women in remote Australia undertake care work at rates higher than anyone else in Australia. Where they undertake that work, they may be unable to commit to take up a guaranteed or subsidised job in addition to that care work, which isn't recognised. And so access to these options is likely reduced when compared with men, for instance. Thirdly, it's seriously questionable under the job guarantee whether there should be any basis for the belief that the private sector will someday magically sort of pick up in remote Australia and thereby facilitate large-scale transitions between a job guarantee, for instance, and the market economy. This hasn't happened yet, despite continued sustained investment, and things are only getting worse. The mining crash is one example here. And obviously there are ethical implications, as Greg pointed out earlier, around continued reliance on that industry. So true recognition of the nature of remote economies may lead to a different policy approach. For instance, one that prioritises wellbeing over market-based work rather than seeing a job, and for that matter, any job, as a panacea to creating wellbeing. Indeed, market-based jobs, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, market-based jobs or subsidised jobs that mimic the market might be detrimental to wellbeing rather than the other way around. So second, I want to turn briefly, and Ben, I'm assuming that you'll just shut me down if I go too long. Just block me.
You're going fine.
Oh, good. Second, I want to turn briefly to the impacts of these proposals on possible incomes. So based on maximum participation, possible single income is higher for the job guarantee, but that's because it offers the potential for full-time work. However, the hourly incomes of the RDES and the job guarantee are both set at the minimum wage and both include full workers' entitlements. While the RDES sits at 89% of the poverty line, the possibility of part unemployment benefit payment would take it above the poverty line. And further, while the LRG already sits above the poverty line, it also proposes a reparation payment for Indigenous Australians, which would also take the possible income under the LRG higher still, though a specific amount is not proposed, rightly so, and thus is not shown in this graph. So while all three of these proposals have the potential to take individuals above the poverty line, access is obviously a significant issue, which links into what I was saying earlier. About definitions of work. So these incomes are contingent on maximum participation, but those who cannot meet maximum participation, particularly under the JG and RDES, would have lower incomes, obviously. This raises the high potential for the RDES and the job guarantee to perpetuate existing labour force inequalities, as I touched on earlier. This raises also the important issue of whether or not these proposals would run alongside other safety net benefits. While all three maintain the possibility of pensions, for example, aged and disability pensions, the claim by Pearson and Mitchell that the JG could remove the need for unemployment benefits altogether is potentially very problematic. It insinuates that all would then be forced into a guaranteed job where many may not be able to do this or may not choose to do this. If, however, these proposals were to run alongside other unemployment benefits, there is still then the continued issue about the need to raise the rate of those unemployment benefits. So that maintains, that continues to be an ongoing issue that we need to pay attention to, so that people are raised above the poverty line. Or there is a need to reconsider the strengths of CDEP-like flexibility, which enabled community-based decisions to be made about whether funds should be used as wages for productive work, for instance, or be used as an unconditional payment, a sort of BI, which might give the best of both worlds at the discretion of local leadership, which takes me on to my third point, and I'm nearly done, around local Indigenous control. So local Indigenous control might transform the kind of upward accountability between third sector providers, or in the case of subsidised jobs, even employers, and governments that is typical of workfare, and resituate it back at the community level. This would not only be more empowering, which has obvious social justice implications, but may lead to greater responsiveness around individual needs, including for people with significant barriers to work, and encourage responses that place well-being at front and centre. However, while the LRG and RDES both include mechanisms for some local control over the types of activities undertaken to receive an income, the JG does not contain any apparent avenues for local Indigenous control. Instead, Pearson and Mitchell argued that the Indigenous employment, Indigenous employment is just, and I quote here, part of the larger problem of Australian unemployment. I'd argue, however, that this risks oversimplifying the barriers to employment faced by Indigenous Australians, particularly living in remote areas, which stem from colonisation, racism, and for those in remote areas, poor proximity to regional and urban markets, which is also a function of colonial policies that displaced Indigenous peoples into remote missions and reserves in the first place, most of which have now become today's discrete Indigenous communities. The failure to recognise work beyond the formal economy, as per the abolishment of CDEP, is also a further cause of unemployment in remote Australia. In this regard, unemployment is not simply obscenely high, to use Noel's words, for Indigenous Australians, but also has different origins, which potentially suggest different responses in terms of both people, that is Indigenous versus non-Indigenous peoples potentially, and also space and place, remote and non-remote areas. I just want to make a final point also. In a broader sense, recognition of the need for input and control over employment policy would also be in the spirit of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, to which Pearson himself is a signatory. Okay, I'll finish now with some brief final points or thoughts. So as I've said a number of times, these are only just a handful of possible implications. There are obviously many others, and further analyses will also be incredibly important as proposals shift and change, and also as new proposals come to the fore potentially. In a broader sense, however, I'd argue that considering options for the future should have the starting point of asking what might a strategy that prioritises well-being, potentially over work, look like? Would this fit within a neoliberal market frame or move beyond this, for example, by decoupling work and income as in a BI, or even the possibility of combining a BI and a job guarantee? We might also ask how block funding approaches, as in CDEP, might enable decisions to mix these forms to be made at the local level, which would be more empowering of communities and also potentially sort of align with place-based policy-making approaches. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to ask what are the intentions and aspirations of remote living Indigenous peoples themselves, and how might a future strategy recognise and meet these needs and aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful paper. Thank you very much, Zoe. So now we'll hand over to our two respondents. First to John Altman, who is the Emeritus Professor at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at ANU. John.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Zoe, for the paper and the presentation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country down here in Fitzroy. Yeah, I think, this is a very ambitious and inspirational paper. I really enjoyed reading it, in part because it really got me re-engaged with a number of issues I've looked at for a terribly long time. And obviously, Zoe and I have already had an interaction around the paper. So I've given Zoe lots of feedback, which I won't go into in great detail here. So Zoe looks at three alternatives to the current draconian, destructive, impoverishing, slavery-like CDEP. And this really, is a program that is extraordinarily destructive, it's hard to believe that it's been in place now for 5 years. And in that time, about 750,000 penalties have been imposed on mainly Indigenous Australians. So people already living below the poverty line have been further impoverished. So Zoe was telling us that she's looking at 3 options, RDES, JG, and LIG, Liveable Income Guarantee. She also, in the introduction, told us that there was 3 others that she could have looked at. And then as she was speaking, I was thinking, of course, there's also one more, which is the 4 to 5 months of the $550 per fortnight COVID supplement and the suspension of mutual obligation. So let me make it quite clear that work that I've been doing with Remote Indigenous Australia, obviously remotely, makes it quite clear that for Remote Indigenous Australia, COVID has had a silver lining. There's been no COVID infection in Remote Indigenous Australia, 0, no deaths, and people have been able to enjoy double their job seeker payment, and they've been able to enjoy the freedom to get back into doing some productive things that they value. So, it's been, a double benefit. And unfortunately, we're now winding back to $250 a fortnight, then it'll go to $150 a fortnight, and then it'll go to 0 a fortnight, possibly, although I doubt it. But nevertheless, people have really benefited from something that's been a little bit like CDEP for a short period. And I think it reminded a lot of remote living Indigenous people just what life was like under CDEP, having pay if they chose to continue their work for the old activities. At least they were getting paid $20 an hour, the minimum award rate, not half the minimum award rate. And if they chose not to go to work, they were still getting $20 an hour, and they could supplement that with additional income. So one of the things that I guess I need to remind people and Zoe about is that when people were under CDEP from 1977 until 2015, firstly, they were paid award rates. Secondly, they were defined as employed, not unemployed. And third, there was no income testing of CDEP. So you could earn anything you wanted to on top of your CDEP basic income, generally paid at 15 hours a week at award rates. And so you could have very positive income effects that Zoe referred to with statistics from the National Aboriginal and Torres Islander Survey that showed back in 2002 that people under CDEP were in fact far better off than unemployed, but of course not as well off as full-time employed people, which is not surprising. So Zoe ambitiously looks at these 3 schemes with 3 proposals with a critical eye. I've already suggested to Zoe that I think she could be a lot more critical of the 3 proposals. I think that they all kowtow to the discourse of the neoliberal state far too much. So they all emphasise the need for some sort of activity testing, and they all want to promulgate the myth that at the end of the rainbow in remote Australia, there are so-called real or mainstream jobs for everybody. We can close the gap in remote Australia, we can close the employment gap in remote Australia, which is absolute and utter nonsense. And we know it, and we've known it for decades. And in some ways, because we knew that in 1977, is why the CDEP scheme was set up to give people part-time employment options. So, an ambitious agenda would in fact bring in CDEP-like programs, and probably the Liveable Income Guarantee is the closest to it, for all Indigenous Australians who either cannot find mainstream work in remote Australia, or else who choose to work in a part-time paid manner, engaging in a whole range of activity, which can be enterprise, social enterprise, community service, or engagement in the customary economy. Anything that improves their livelihood, but with a basic income equivalent to something like 15 hours at the minimum award, guaranteed. So I guess, out of this exploration, I really think that there's some potentiality to tease out, what was it about CDEP that made it interestingly popular, very popular with Indigenous people, but very unpopular with the political and bureaucratic classes, and some Indigenous spokespeople, very powerful Indigenous spokespeople. But the people who participated in the scheme, really, preferred it to other alternatives. It never precluded people from getting full-time employment if it was available. And one of the really telling issues with CDEP was when full-time opportunity came along. For example, when part-time CDEP employed rangers were given opportunity to participate in the Working on Country program, a number of them exited from CDEP, initially to full-time working on country jobs, but then a number of those people then actually fell back from full-time working on country work to part-time working on country work. So we've just got to recognise that, if I can use the language of economics, people's utility functions in remote Indigenous Australia are going to be enormously diverse. But part of the evidence I think that we've had now for a long time is that there is a preference for part-time work, there's a preference for flexibility, there's a preference for moving into engagement with market capitalism, engagement with the customary sector, with the non-market, and engagement with, state support, but not state support that's delivered in a punitive manner, which is how that state support has fundamentally shifted in the last decade. So what we're seeing now in terms of the punitive requirements for compliance are not part of the social compact that remote Indigenous Australians entered into with the Australian state. When they, in my view, said, we want to live remotely. Increasingly, we want to live remotely on land that we own. We're getting our rightful share in terms of land restitution. We recognise that we mightn't have incomes equivalent to other Australians, and we recognise that we mightn't have home ownership like other Australians, but nevertheless, we will get a certain level of guaranteed income without activity testing. And it's only in the 21st century that activity testing has not only slipped in, but has become more and more draconian, more and more punitive. There's been more and more surveillance from outside, and there's been more and more financial penalty. So I've probably said more than I should. It's a terrific paper. We'll keep engaging on it. I think it's got enormous potentiality. There's obviously only so much you can do in an article. When you look at your 6 or 7 options, you can write the book. But I think it's a terrific piece. So thank you very much, Zoe.
Thanks, John. So is there anything you wanted to say briefly now before going on to Elise, or do you want to do it at the end?
Just to say thanks very much, John. I appreciate that feedback and completely agree with everything you've just said. And I think your point around, the COVID supplement as well, and then the removal or suspension of mutual obligation is a great one. And I've got ethics clearance to do some research on that now, so I'm starting that now. So I'm looking forward to working on that issue a little bit more. But yeah, other than just to say thanks very much, and thanks for your written feedback as well. Appreciate it. Thanks, Ben.
Ben, we could probably just skip Elise.
For those who are not accustomed, Troy and Elise do know each other.
Like a brother.
So Elise Klein, OAM, is our next respondent, also from ANU, but from the Crawford School of Public Policy.
Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak about Zoe's paper. I also want to acknowledge the unceded countries in which we're meeting on, and particularly for me on the Ngambri and Ngunnawal country, unceded. And I think this discussion is really important, and I hope that it feeds into to working through the unfinished business that we have here in Australia. Thank you so much for this excellent paper, Zoe. I really, like John, really enjoyed engaging with it and thinking through, and thank you for such a thoughtful piece. I think you raised some really interesting points. I should disclose, if you didn't hear at the start, that I'm one of the co-authors of the Liveable Income Guarantee. So I read this, I think, in two sort of spaces, but also with great interest, having our work be analysed in such a thoughtful and engaged way. I've learnt a lot from reading this paper also. I share the view with John that this is a very important piece. So thank you for that. Just a few comments there and about the Liveable Income Guarantee just generally, and I think that'll help sort of frame my comments and questions later on. It was very much, and it is very much, a work in progress. It was a collaborative process between the 5 authors. I don't think we all agree completely on certain points, and so the points that I will raise will be mine, and I don't know if they can be reflected in all 5 of the other authors. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more. Troy might be able to put in his bits later as well. But it was a collaborative process amidst the COVID lockdown, which Zoe acknowledges. And it was an idea for all residents across Australia, not just First Nations people. And so it was also a policy brief, so it does lack detail, but because it is still a work in progress, this process, this conversation now in this workshop, Zoe's work, is very important for us to think with, further developing the idea and working on it a little bit more. The other thing I say is that the Liveable Income Guarantee, how we were sort of thinking about remote and regional employment, and particularly how these issues impact First Nations people, we probably thought very much that it linked very much with the RDES. And so where it lacks detail there is because I know when I was sort of working on it, I was thinking about what was put forward by the RDES, and that's why I guess we sort of link it to the Remote Job Centre's proposal. But also I wasn't involved in that process, but I do know the amount of work that was put in to creating that process and all the different people involved in that process, APONT, and all the organisations within that. And so it felt a bit ingenuine to try and propose something over the top. So I definitely saw the LIG linking in with the work that had already been done. But at the same time, driven by the research that was done around CDEP and thinking about what was very successful about that, which I guess was inspiration to some of what came out in the LIG. So just 3 points, and there's related questions to each. Like John, I think, it was important in the paper to acknowledge the sheer cruelty of the current situation and the damage of CDP and what that's bringing to people's life. I don't think there's any research that I'm aware of that shows that CDP is an appropriate policy response. And so, you know, I think it's really fitting that this project, this paper that Zoe's presenting, rejects the current situation and notes that it's extremely harmful. But also just to put, I think it was an important point that she makes around 30,000 CDP participants operating at around $300 million per year. And so my calculation, that's a $10,000 per person to run this thing, not including the social security payments. And I think that's an interesting sort of point that Zoe makes to think about, you know, the potential of what could be done else with that money that's already being spent. But also to acknowledge in three proposals the authorship of Pearson, and I think it would be useful, and I'm keen to sort of hear sort of Zoe's sort of thinking around Pearson's role in the destruction of CDEP and the implementation of CDP. And now sort of the next part of the story is he trying to propose a job guarantee, and I'm curious to sort of understand your sort of thinking of that story. The second point I wanted to make is one thing that troubles me a bit about the three proposals, and also the lack of a universal basic income, a completely non-conditional approach as a proposal, is I can't help but reflect on a seemingly distrust in First Nations people, a distrust in how people will spend their time, and therefore having to have programs to manage people's time. And to me, it's a bit reminiscent of ways in which First Nations people have not been trusted with money, and so, for example, weren't paid wages. So, just to quote a 1948 excerpt of the Batman Royal Commission on the Survey of Native Affairs in Western Australia. And I think this is interesting because the kind of language that Bateman is using here, we still see it in current policy, which you'll probably note. They say any system of payment of wages must be introduced gradually. A sudden decision to pay natives in cash would not be in the best interests of natives themselves. The present generation have no sense of money values whatsoever, and they would become a prey to the unscrupulous hawker who would persuade them to spend their money on useless articles. It would also encourage drinking and gambling and would have the effect of throwing many of them out of employment. There is no doubt in my mind that the premature cash payment to natives before they have been educated properly in its use is one of the greatest factors of their degradation. So, of course, today people are still not trusted with money. We see that with income management and the attempts to continue that program currently in Parliament. But also, what I wanted to add is, like the distrust in money, there's a distrust with what people will do with their time. And there seems to be an enduring fear about what will become of people whose time isn't managed. Now, my understanding of the literature is that there have been few studies of First Nations time use, but John Altman's work has been a major contribution in this space, and has shown how people are incredibly productive in many, many ways, which is what has led to his work around the hybrid economy. Yet still a deficit discourse persists. And of course, it's levelled also at First Nations unemployed, but there's something specific about what's levelled at First Nations people and needing to manage people's time use. And so I could not help but wonder if this fear about what First Nations people might do with their time if it's not managed is what a part of a reason why basic income isn't circulating in the public as a major option for remote Australia. I'm curious to Zoe's thoughts on this and time management more broadly. just to sort of think through those thoughts compared with the LIG, because I guess if you're thinking about it in sort of the remote setting, some people may ask similar questions about the livable income guarantee. I guess our discussion had been very much about that we definitely and fundamentally believe that people do all sorts of important productive things, either that are expropriated by the formal economy or not, but still extremely important and productive. And do reject people needing to be managed, but yet still we do have a participation requirement, although the management of this is very different to, I guess, the workfare and the current sort of job network workfare situation, and where people's contributions are reported like they're based on a trust system, very much like the tax system, where people submit what their contributions have been and may or may not be audited later on. But there are two reasons, and there are two reasons why we made this. One is a very sort of pragmatic kind of thought around the participation component would be more politically palatable in the current moment, and it makes me wonder about what the decisions and the discussions around the RDES were, and I think, you know, my earlier comments about the cruelty of the situation, I think it's important to acknowledge how they how the current situation shapes thinking and proposals such as this. But second, the livable income guarantee, and I guess to the point, was an Australia-wide proposal, but it was really trying to redefine what work is and how it's considered in Australia, and it was really trying to push how contributions that are acknowledged under the livable income guarantee are often work that sits outside of what is considered as the real economy, but it's productive work, and it's important social contribution and ecological contribution. And by including this as work within the livable income guarantee, we hope to destabilise norms around what work is. And we saw that the participation piece was important in this. But I guess my question is how that then translates into the remote context, I think is, and the kind of politics around that is, I think, a really important piece, which Zoe's work has made me think more about. The third and my sort of last point is I think Zoe's important discussion around First Nations people needing to have control over these programs is important and well taken. But my sort of question, how far can any of these programs go, even if they are Indigenous-led, within a settler state structure? My sense is that these proposals can only ever go so far when sovereignty isn't honoured and self-determination is denied. And we see this specifically with the story of CDEP, which Zoe talks about being turned into CDP, where these policies are at the whim of settler governments and can be turned into something of their choosing. So I'd love to sort of get Zoe's thoughts more on that, and perhaps, you know, if this was you had three different sort of ways in which you reviewed each of the three programs, I'm wondering if this could be a fourth area about how much do these programs unsettle settler structures. And I guess this was the sort of thinking around the reparative supplement that was with the Liveable Income Guarantee. It was an idea that came from the movement of Black Lives. Their proposal of basic income is not under their economic security platform, but under reparative justice. And it's proposed as part of various programs that are to acknowledge structural wrongs, but also redistribute as part of a reparative process, part of slavery and addressing slavery and Jim Crow in the US. The supplement we propose is not a reparation, but it is put there as part of an acknowledgement of, I guess, three things. to put in the minds of the settler population that so much has been taken from First Nations people and that there is unfinished business in this country, to an acknowledgement of the role that social security has played in the settler colonial process, from rations through to CDEP and the cashless debit card income management, and that any universal payment is possibly problematic in a settler state as it assumes a rightful share to all, yet some people have had more taken, and specifically First Nations people. And so the idea behind the supplement is to provoke an unpicking of settler colonialism, and to work alongside other processes such as treaty, other reparative payments, and self-determination. So I guess that sort of question is, how much can we think of these programs as being provocations to unpicking of the settler state? But Zoe, thank you very much, and I really have learned a lot from this paper, and the your points that you raise, I think, will really help in us reworking and keep this livable income guarantee as a sort of a live idea. So thank you for engaging with it.
Thank you so much, Elise. I might do a call out for anyone to put their hand up if they have a question, but I might hand over to Zoe to respond to any of that while I wait for questions.
Thanks, Ben. Elise, thanks so much for all of that incredibly thoughtful feedback. Again, I completely agree with all of those last points. I'll try and address your points. I won't be able to address them in great detail here, but maybe we can keep talking. The first point around Pearson's thinking in terms of he was directly involved and in the destruction of CDEP. And so many were surprised to see him come out this year with the job guarantee proposal. Look, Pearson himself is best to talk to his thinking around that, but I think there are some things to note that haven't changed in his thinking. And that's the first thing, or the first thing is that, the fervent kind of hope of the growth of an economy in remote Australia, and that someday sort of jobs will just appear. And a lot of his organisations work towards that as well. So I think that that's obviously really problematic, and I don't think he grapples deeply with that at all still, and I think that's a significant problem. But like I said, I think he's best to talk to that. On the second point that you raised around the basic income, absolutely. It's not addressed in the paper to any great extent, because the paper was sort of meant to provoke discussion around then basic income, I think, as another option, as well in this discussion. But it is an incredibly important alternative option as well. And I think you're right in saying that mistrust of Indigenous peoples more generally is a feature of policy making across Australian history and across policy portfolios. I mean, that's just, it kind of goes without saying, and it's incredibly disturbing. And I think it's probably your points around how people spend their money and how people spend their time are really good ones. And I think that probably goes to maybe a lack of serious discussion around basic income in remote Australia. I think part of that's also, people are so desperate to get away from bloody workfare that's so destructive, and going to, back to the LIG, which is, I think, proposed as sort of a stepping stone approach as well, potentially a stepping stone approach. I think that speaks to, the kind of I suppose the fact that the proposals that are on the table now aren't so extreme, as maybe a basic income in remote Australia might be seen to be. So potentially a stepping stone approach, but I agree that basic income in remote Australia should be seriously considered. I think that that's an important thing to keep talking about. On your third point around whether, anything serious can be achieved within the architecture of the settler state, I completely agree again. I mean, I think that all of the And you're right, that's really missing from the paper in its current iteration. I had a discussion with a colleague the other day where we were sort of talking about all of my work across different Indigenous policy spaces and things like that. And I sort of said to him, but it's really frustrating because every time I go to write a paper, I just want to write, well, sovereignty, you know, like, let's just start and end there, you know, like that's the key overriding issue here that still hasn't been grappled with. And so I completely agree with you on that point as well. I'm not sure if that actually answers any of your questions, but like I said, that was very detailed, and thanks for your thinking around all of that, and maybe we can just keep discussing those things as well. Thanks, Elise.
Wonderful. It's a great discussion from all three of the participants. Thank you very much. Is there anyone who has a question? Oh, yeah. So, Roger. You're still on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
I always forget. Sorry about that. Thanks for a very interesting set of discussions. The whole day has been great. All of them. But I just wanted to come to something that came up in the discussion today, which I think is really interesting, which is the comment I think that John made about the impact of the COVID supplement and how it's had the effect of raising the income for a particularly vulnerable group of people who could really use it, and of course it's going to be taken away. And I was wondering if anybody has any plans or intentions to use a big panel data set. I don't know if Hilda could do it or if there's another one available to actually see if we could track whether there was an increase in a whole lot of important outcomes over that exact period of time, because it would be very, very useful to do that, to demonstrate that if, by increasing the amount of money that a particularly vulnerable group of people get, their incomes improve. I did work on a paper on almost a decade ago now on what happened to child poverty during the GFC, when the government rolled out a whole lot of extra payments for low-income families. And we did find in that paper a notable increase in subjective well-being for very poor persons in Australia, just around the time of when those payments were made. Anyway, that's just one sort of idea that could be put forward. I don't know if it's feasible given the amount of data we have on Indigenous populations, so I'll just throw it back to the group. Thanks.
I'll just make one comment, Roger. I think that's a really important point you make. The only work I've done is with some of the remote stores, because during this period, there has been a House of Representatives inquiry into food prices and food security in remote Indigenous Australia. So work that I've done with some of the stores shows that when people got the COVID supplement, surprise, surprise, store turnover more or less doubled, and people were buying fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, healthy foods, but also they were buying a lot of equipment to help them self-provision. And I try to encourage some of the stores to actually collect data on some of these, and the data will be there. The question is whether somebody can now go and analyze what's happened in terms of, individual and community expenditure at these remote stores. And then obviously there's going to be other variables to look at. What has happened in terms of, crime, like the stores again reported that there was less break-in by kids. What's happened in terms of health clinics? Is there any correlation between people getting more income, less ill health, less presentation for domestic violence, etc. So I think there's some really important questions that could be asked.
Can I just add to that as well? Yeah, I completely agree, Roger. I think it's a great opportunity, and it's kind of a really fantastic natural experiment to sort of say what might happen with a basic income, to go to Elise's point earlier, because it sort of sets the conditions, it sets conditions that are very similar to what might prevail under a basic income. So, yeah, definitely plans to, as I said earlier, I'm doing some case studies on communities across Cape York around that, and so a series of interviews, but also to look at public administrative data and what's happened there, including crime data as well, as John referred to. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. Yeah, thanks.
And just letting people know, there's a bunch of comments that have just been made with links to papers and other research that is going on that Elise is doing, Ben Phillips and others. We're very close to time. If there's a final question. Otherwise, I think we might need to move on to our next paper. So just before we do that, a really big thank you to Zoe, John and Elise. That was a fantastic discussion, so thanks very much.